James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. At 10:15, the sound of musketry on the heights of Puebla announced to 150,000 warriors that the conflict had commenced, which was to send many of their number to sleep with their fathers. As in almost every action fought in a mountainous district, this one was ushered in with the usual pop, then pop, pop, afterwards pop, 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 and so on, till these ominous sounds ended in general volleys, accompanied with the British cheer or French "Vive l'Empereur," as the tide of success for the time influenced the feelings of the parties. General Murillo, with the 5th Spanish Army, being on the right, was the first to lead the way. His troops, having acted for some time in conjunction with the corps under Sir Rowland Hill, were considered superior to almost every other body of Spaniards under the immediate command of Lord Wellington. Indeed, when commanded by Murillo in person, they were looked upon as nearly equal to the second description of Portuguese infantry. On this occasion, they showed themselves possessed of many valuable qualities, but these were neutralized by the lack of confidence in their officers, for with the exception of the chief himself and a few more of the superior officers, the men really had no confidence in them. Upon the whole, however, they attacked with spirit and drove back the enemy in pretty good style. But the superiority in point of ground, and later in numbers, would have given the French a decided advantage over their opponents, had not the 71st British Regiment and light companies of the 2nd Division arrived on the heights soon after the action began to support our allies. This seasonable reinforcement enabled Murillo to continue his offensive operations until every post which the enemy occupied on the heights at the commencement was taken from them. In this little brush, Murillo was wounded, the French commandant was made prisoner, and the brave Cadogan received his mortal wound. The heights of Puebla were no sooner in our keeping than the French marshal perceived the value of the prize of which his bungling conduct had deprived him. To regain the key of his position, therefore, his efforts were for 2 hours afterwards almost exclusively directed. This led to the following interesting operations. The enemy's intentions were no sooner discovered than fresh troops were dispatched to the assistance of the Spaniards and British light infantry on the heights. The 50th and 92nd Regiments were the first to proceed on that duty, and had almost gained the summit of the mountain when they were ordered to retrace their steps. But they had not descended more than halfway when a third order stopped the retrograde movement and separated the battalions, the former receiving instructions to proceed to its original destination on the heights, and the latter to move across the face of the hill and drive back a body of about 4,000 French infantry, which had been pushed forward to form an advanced link in the chain of communication between the troops stationed within and around the clump of planting and those to be employed in the recapture of the heights, about 7,000 in number. The separation of the 50th and 92nd Regiments was not much relished by the soldiers of either corps, but there being no alternative, part they did. The former clambered up the face of the hill till, arriving at the summit, they wheeled to the left and proceeded along the ridge about half a mile, till they arrived at the brink of a deep ravine, which ran quite across the hill a little above, and to the left of the column which the 92nd were about to attack. Here the Spaniards lay along the face of the mountain, and, with the 71st on their right, were engaged in a tirailleur fire with the enemy. On taking leave of the 50th, the 92nd Regiment descended the hill a few hundred yards, and then, after wheeling a quarter circle to their right, directed their march towards their opponents, who were posted on a ridge several hundred yards distant, in our progress to which we moved through fields of wheat, considerably taller than any of our men, and over ditches so thickly lined with thorns and briars that the blood ran trickling down many of the soldiers' legs long before we arrived at the base of the eminence. On crossing the last ditch at the foot of the hill, the battalion loaded, then advanced in line, slowly and with a firm pace, every moment expecting a glimpse of the enemy, from whom they looked for a volley by way of a friendly welcome to the summit of the mossy ridge. With breathless anxiety we pursued our course. Not a whisper was heard. All was still as death, save when our colonel, riding along the line, addressed his followers, some in English, others in Gaelic, calling upon them to be firm, resolute, and steady, and on no account to throw away their fire till they had an object in view. He also urged them to be silent till the order to charge was given, when the whole were to join in the good old British cheer till they came in contact with the enemy, or the latter had fled, when they were again to resume their former silence. Full of hope, joy beamed on every countenance, till on arriving within a short distance of where the foe were originally posted, we beheld our antagonists formed on another height, some distance in rear of the one they had occupied, to which they had rather precipitately retired during our advance. To hazard an opinion as to what would have been the result of the conflict, had the enemy not retired, may be considered superfluous. But I may say that as there were no more troops belonging to either nation who could have been brought into play for nearly a quarter of an hour, the two parties, left to settle their own quarrel, would no doubt have considered themselves fairly pitted against each other, in order that the prowess of Frenchmen and Scotsmen might be put to a proper test, in the face of 150,000 of their respective countrymen and their allies, and that, as the issue was to settle the claims of each party, it is but natural to suppose that a severe and bloody action would have taken place. General, the Honourable William Stewart, commanding the 2nd Division, arrived just as we had gained the top of the ridge. Finding the enemy had retired, he ordered us to form column at quarter distance, and then ordered 2 Spanish pieces of artillery to a rising ground on our right to cannonade the enemy at the clump of planting formerly mentioned. This drew upon us the fire of a French battery on the left of the wood, which caused us the loss of a sergeant, corporal, and some privates. During the cannonade, General Stewart, addressing Colonel Cameron, said, "Poor Cadogan, I regret to hear, is mortally wounded. The French are pushing strong columns towards our right. They must be opposed." Then, waving his hand so as to describe a half-circle in his front, the general continued, "In front, Colonel, it is all sunshine, all sunshine. It is on the heights of Puebla the battle must be fought. Being now the senior officer in the 1st Brigade, you will instantly proceed thither with your battalion, assume the command on the heights, yield it to none without a written order from Sir Rowland Hill or myself, and defend your position while you have a man remaining." Then, taking a pencil from his pocket, he wrote an order to the above effect, the shot and shell flying about his ears all the time. To receive this order, Colonel Cameron left an officer with General Stewart, and with his corps proceeded towards the scene of action on the heights, where, as the sequel will show, both were much wanted. Some time previous to this movement being made, Sir Rowland Hill had attacked the French advanced posts in front of Sabujana de Alava, for the double purpose of preventing them from sending more troops to the heights and taking possession of the village, should an opportunity offer. The 2nd and 3rd Brigades of the 2nd Division were accordingly ordered on this service, and conducted themselves with their usual gallantry. They advanced with great firmness and bravery, but being opposed to men who knew what was required of soldiers on the field of battle, their first efforts were not crowned with that success which their conduct merited. However, this did not in the least degree depress their spirits. Again they advanced and gained ground, but were once more forced to retire. During these and many other attacks which followed, it was truly interesting to witness the cool bravery displayed by the assailants, who, after every successive repulse, advanced to the very muzzles of their opponents' pieces before they gave their fire. As the wave, when foiled in its attempt to force itself over the boundary which nature has set for it, recedes but to return with increased force, so were the assaults of our friends renewed, till by the most praiseworthy perseverance and heroic bravery they finally carried their point and established themselves in the village of Sabujana de Alava. It would be an act of injustice, however, were I to omit to state that the vanquished also did everything in their power to ensure a different result. More devoted bravery than that which was exhibited at this point by both parties is but seldom seen on a field of battle. A considerable time before the village fell into our hands, the 92nd Regiment had arrived on the heights and taken part in the operations in that quarter. Ascending the hill in an oblique direction, the 92nd first touched the summit at a point about half a mile in rear of the post occupied by the 50th Regiment. Immediately in front of the latter, a deep ravine ran quite across the mountain, the western side of which was in possession of the 71st and 50th Regiments, and the opposite bank in that of the enemy. The western slope was extremely abrupt, and from the bottom of the ravine really of difficult access. In possession of such a position, in the face of an enemy greatly superior in numbers, common prudence would have dictated that the best policy was to remain on the defensive. Unfortunately, however, Lieutenant Colonel R.I. was not of that opinion. Being the senior officer on the heights after the fall of Cadogan, he, contrary to the advice of the field officers of the 71st Regiment, ordered that corps to cross the ravine and attack a portion of the enemy's troops occupying a position on the northern slope of the hill. With sad presages of the consequences, the gallant light bobs set out on their perilous excursion. Perceiving their intention, the enemy formed two bodies of infantry in order to kill, wound, or capture the whole of the assailants. These corps were kept out of view of the British, and as the latter moved round the northern, the former kept moving round the southern slope, till, being nearly in rear of the 71st, they sprung upon them like tigers, pouring on them volleys of musketry which made many, both officers and men, bite the dust. To extricate them from this perilous situation required the full exercise of all the good military qualities which the whole body of the 71st were known to possess. From the number of killed and wounded, it was afterwards evident that in their unrivalled exertions to escape from the fangs of their opponents, the 71st had not been sparing of their powder. But what could they achieve against such odds? To rejoin the 50th was the utmost they could hope for. To that point, therefore, they directed their steps. To the same point, the French troops were marching and had partially turned the left of the 71st when the 92nd arrived to take part in the struggle. On procuring a firm footing on the heights, the 92nd halted for a minute till the rear closed up, and then, in open column of companies right in front, was hurried along at nearly a double-quick pace, till it arrived within 200 yards of the 50th. Time being precious, we were ordered to form line on the right centre company without halting. As soon as the four leading companies had filed so far to their right that the right centre one could move forward at the double-quick step, Colonel Cameron, placing himself on the left of that company, called to the piper to play the gathering of the Camerons, and then, addressing the officer who led that company, said, "Now, push forward in double-quick time and give it to them sweetly." During the advance, a dread silence reigned through the ranks, the men's thoughts being employed in the business on which they were to be engaged. Animated by the presence of their chief and the warlike sounds of their favourite bagpipe, the men advanced with a front firm, as the rocks of their native mountains to meet the foe, flushed with a temporary success over their countrymen. The reunion of the two regiments, the 50th and 92nd, caused the most lively sensation. As the latter approached the right of the former, the whole of the 50th, officers and men, joined in 3 hearty cheers. On arriving at the verge of the western bank of the ravine, up which the French troops were scrambling, the Highlanders, on perceiving the latter, first poured down upon them a shower of shot, then re-echoed the cheers of their friends on the left, and with the rapidity of lightning, dispatched a second volley into the thickest of the enemy's ranks, which had the effect of making them fly precipitately down the brow of the ravine, the living on their feet, and the dead in the manner of round logs of wood. This rapid movement secured a safe retreat to the 71st Regiment, which now slowly retired to a position on our right. This unfortunate attempt to regain possession of the heights did not deter the enemy from making another trial. The beaten troops were moved round the northern shoulder of the hill on the eastern bank of the ravine, and a fresh body of infantry, in total ignorance of the dangers they had to encounter, carried round the southern side to assault us in the same position from before which their companions had so recently been driven. In about half an hour the head of the French column began to descend the opposite eminence, to check which a few light troops kept up a smart fire of small arms. But the others, arranged along the brink of the ravine in a sitting posture, were ordered to slope their muskets to the rear and to remain in this position till the enemy had arrived within 20 or 30 paces of them, when the whole were to stand up and bestow upon the assailants as many peppercorns as they could conveniently spare. These orders were admirably obeyed. Not a whisper was heard, scarcely a shot was fired during the interval between the crossing of the ravine by the enemy and their arrival near the summit of the bank. As before, however, silence was broken on our lads resuming their standing position and giving the foe their first fire. The scene which followed was equally animated as that which preceded it. After a smart rencounter, in which the 50th, 71st and 92nd Regiments took part, the French, as before, were driven back with considerable loss. The fugitives, as on the former occasion, were withdrawn round the northern side of the hill, and a third column of attack formed on the southern side to make another dash at us in order to obtain possession of that position which they should never have lost. In this last effort, the enemy was far from exhibiting the same spirit as in the 2 former ones, although he made a much greater display of his numerical force. In order to intimidate us, masses of infantry crowned the height, but none of them moved forward to support the troops advanced towards us, whose efforts were feeble and altogether unworthy of themselves. This we attributed to the situation of their affairs in the centre, which a short time before had begun to take an active part in the business of the day. Sir Rowland Hill being in possession of Sabujana de Alava, the 3rd, 4th, 7th and Light Divisions crossed the Zadorra between 12 and 1 o'clock at various points, a little in front of the enemy, and attacked their centre and right centre columns with much gallantry. Sir Rowland Hill doing himself the honour of waiting on the French left centre divisions in a similar manner, accompanied with the troops under his personal command. From this period down to 4 o'clock, events of the most important and interesting description were every moment taking place along the whole of Zadorra's Vale, from where the hero of Salamanca issued his mandate to his followers, to that spot which the hero of Barossa was deluging with blood, in order to cut off the communication of the enemy with France by the principal and direct road to Saint-Jean-de-Luz. But who will attempt to describe these events, as viewed by us from the blood-stained heights of Puebla? I confess myself unable to do so as they ought. Let any man fancy himself standing on the summit of a high hill, looking down on a plain covered with 150,000 men, from 10,000 to 15,000 horse, and from 300 to 400 pieces of artillery vomiting fire and death in every direction, and thousands of the infantry pointing their deadly weapons at each other, the space between the belligerents barely permitting them to do so without crossing the muzzles of their pieces. And he will have some faint idea of what passed on the plains of Vitoria, and be able to paint in imagination a few of those extraordinary scenes to which we were witnesses. The admirable manner in which the troops employed against the enemy's centre moved forward to the assault was the theme of general admiration among all ranks on the heights. Joseph Bonaparte and his Major General Marshal Jourdan had been at great pains to strengthen this part of their position, aware that if they were driven from it, the battle was lost. Every little eminence literally bristled with cannon, behind which at least 40,000 infantry were drawn up in dense masses, ready to pounce upon all who should attempt to attack them. The French troops being formed within a very narrow space, the service in that quarter during the early part of the action was extremely hot. Notwithstanding the cool and determined conduct of our companions in their first rencounter, it was not at all surprising that the thundering of the cannon and cheers of the combatants should in a little time produce feelings which none but those who were on the heights can at all describe. Although we never had the smallest doubt as to the issue of the battle, yet I confess that it was with equal pride and pleasure that we beheld from the heights a wavering in some of the enemy's battalions about half an hour after the engagement began in the centre. Yes, it was with pleasure, for so close and murderous was the conflict in that quarter that had not the enemy given way. Thousands more of our countrymen must have fallen under the terrific fire of their opponents, it being well known that French infantry will sustain a discharge of musketry for a long time with unflinching courage. We were, therefore, not at all disappointed to perceive that our small arms sometimes made but a feeble impression on their ranks. For in the first place, it convinced the soldiers that they were opposed to troops against whom they would require to use all the physical as well as moral courage which they possessed, and the officers that something besides powder and shot would have to be employed before the French infantry could be forced from their stronghold. For some time, therefore, volley succeeded volley, and the discharges from the artillery rolled in a terrific manner along the vale, without producing any result beyond that of winding up the spirits of our men to the highest pitch to which the bravery of men can be screwed. One of the finest qualities which British soldiers possess is that on all occasions their courage invariably rises in proportion to the exertions required of them, a quality which was never more nobly exhibited than on the plains of Vitoria. On going into action, almost every soldier resolves to be in possession of the laurel leaf or a grave before it is done. On this occasion they were unanimous. Never was there a finer field offered them to show their unanimity than Vitoria, and never did they exhibit it to greater advantage. Proud of his followers and unwilling to throw away any more of their precious lives than was absolutely necessary, Lord Wellington gave orders to make use of a weapon at all times irresistible in the hands of British troops. The bayonet, brought to its proper position, was therefore directed to bend its course towards the hitherto immovable columns of the enemy. Firmly the latter awaited the coming storm, apparently resolved to brave the furious onset. "Vive l'Empereur!" ran along the line with the rapidity of lightning. But in wishing long life to their sovereign, the soldiers were not unmindful of their own, and consequently, as soon as the hostile lines approached close enough to make use of the steel, the enemy uniformly gave way. From the first partial breaking of the French line in the centre, the scene of active operation took a wider range. The enemy, driven from their vantage ground and perceiving their principal communication with France seriously endangered, at once resolved to make every hedge a rampart and every ditch or rivulet a river, and to defend them to the last extremity, to give time to their baggage and their artillery to draw off towards Pampeluna. Arranging themselves, therefore, behind the various ditches and hedges which intersected the fields in every direction, they compelled the British troops to extend their lines also, in order to oppose a front equal to that of the enemy. Interesting as were the first operations when viewed from the heights of Puebla, those which succeeded were much more so. The salvos of artillery, indeed, were neither so frequent nor so appalling, but the volleys of musketry were more numerous, and that beautiful mode of firing called running fire was practiced on a scale of greater magnitude than had ever before been witnessed by any British officer. How often, during the awful struggle, did I witness the British soldiers walk up to the brink of a ditch, behind which their opponents were arrayed, and in the most cool and determined manner cross their pieces with the latter before they gave their fire. On those occasions, the conflict invariably assumed a sanguinary aspect, for the ditches being generally too deep for our men to pass in face of an enemy, the French always remained on the opposite side and kept up a smart fire of musketry till our artillery or cavalry could be brought forward to dislodge them. In this manner, the battle raged in the centre from 1 o'clock till 4, by which time the French had been pushed back almost to Vitoria, where all was confusion and dismay, and from whence Joseph and Jourdan were flying to secure their personal safety. From Lord Wellington's mode of proceeding on the right and in the centre, it was evident that he relied not a little on the faithful execution of that part of the operations entrusted to Sir Thomas Graham for the success of his enterprise. When the hour passed at which the latter was to attack, 1 o'clock, Lord Wellington appeared uneasy, and I believe dispatched more than one courier to ascertain the real cause of Sir Thomas Graham's non-appearance. Be this as it may, it was not long after the hour when Sir Thomas brought his men into action and began that struggle, the issue of which destroyed all the hopes of the enemy and turned a simple defeat into one of the most complete routes recorded in history. The French infantry on the heights, seeing that all was lost in the centre and on the right, began to execute a retrograde movement between 4 and 5 o'clock. On their intentions being discovered, the 1st Brigade, the 50th, 71st and 92nd Regiments, and 2 Portuguese brigades, which had arrived on the hill some time before, gave chase to the fugitives. But so superior were the enemy at this game that in an hour and a half we entirely lost sight of them, although we ran almost all the way. On mentioning this circumstance to a French officer one day, he said, "I will back my countrymen against all the soldiers in the world in a race of that kind." Continuing the pursuit, we passed Vitoria, and at 11 o'clock p.m. bivouacked in a field a league and a half in front of it. By this time the night was so dark that it was with difficulty we could discover the person immediately before us. Notwithstanding this, however, the troops who had been opposed to each other in the centre and on the left during the day seemed unwilling to relinquish the honourable avocation of killing and maiming one another, for the deadly strife continued in those quarters till 11 o'clock in the evening. The price paid for this splendid victory was from 4,000 to 5,000 British and Portuguese killed and wounded. The loss of the French was never accurately ascertained, but was estimated at from 10,000 to 15,000 killed, wounded and prisoners. All their cannon, save 2 pieces, and all their baggage, money, ammunition and provisions fell into our hands. That concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.